Hello and welcome to the Writer's Workshop with Flutter Priest and Milk.
Yes.
This week on Writer's Workshop, we're going to be going over Funeral Song by Laarsgaard. This is a story that Milk picked out. So, Milk, what can you tell us about the story?
It's basically kind of a feel story. There is a bit of death into it. Centered around the changeling invasion, as you'll probably see as we go here. It it's kind of hard to say. I really enjoyed it when it first came out and was around for a bit, but it didn't really go anywhere in terms of traction. So I'm kind of excited to go back into it and see if it's kind of holds up to what I remember it as.
Alrighty, I think that's really fair. This is an M-rated story for gore, alternate universe, and sad and tragedy. The description that we're looking at here is a guard struggles desperately to save his family from changelings during the attack on Canterlot and make his sacrifice worthwhile. Short, sweet, to the point. Let's jump straight in. Funeral Song, 3,820 words. The shield shattered, bursting apart into millions of tiny particles, engulfing the city in a fine pink dust. The changelings charged out of the sky, their bug-like wings humming and causing the air to distort around them. The fiends left craters in the ground as they smashed into homes and cities and streets about the city, causing untold destruction. Citizens who were too slow upon seeing the enemy were trapped as the changelings leapt upon their victims, sucking them dry of emotion. After the changelings were done, they would smash their victims aside and leave them, broken and bloody, to die on the street. The guards reacted as swiftly as possible, steel and bone clashing as combat began. Pegasi swooped through the air, smacking changelings down into the dirt to join their brothers on the ground, while unicorn troops sent massive bolts of energy into the enemy. Blood and vitae spewed across buildings and cobblestone, staining the streets, a heady mixture of dark green and violent red. The guards were determined to hold their ground, forming a line in front of the palace. The changeling smashed against the guards' redoubt, time and time again. Each charge only added to dead piling up around the ground. The guards had their steel, and the changelings had their fury, and it came to a stalemate as members of both sides died in droves. Out in the streets, changelings stalked in the alleyways, hunting down the scared and unsuspecting. Wood burst apart under chitinous gapped feet, broke apart doors as the scent of emotion leaked out into the street from ponies hiding inside of their homes. The screams were blood-chilling as the changelings would drag their victims into the streets to suck them dry and break their skulls open. If one stayed on the streets or in their home, they were signing their life away as the guards flocked from the streets to the palace, where the fighting was the heaviest. He wasn't headed to the palace. He was headed for his home, where his wife and child had been staying, waiting for the reception. In his mind, he prayed that the changelings hadn't found them yet. He sprinted up the street, and his armor rattling against his back and sweat beading against his forehead as he ran. There he saw it, a squat little building, the color of the sunset, with a curved purple roof. The door was splintered with one portion hanging from the top hinge, swinging back and forth. Fear shot through his veins like ice, gripping his heart and causing his gut to clench. He could hear his wife screaming like a banshee and his daughter's sobs. He picked up his pace, his heart pounding and his blood rushing in his ears. He rounded the doorway into his house and was greeted with a blood trail leading back into his bedroom. He flapped his wings, propelling himself into his home and around the corner. And at the end of the trail was a screaming and bleeding wife who was doing her best to fend off the deadly attacks of the changeling. His daughter sat in the corner, covering her head and sobbing, covering from head to hoof in her mother's blood. He swung out and caught the changeling in the abdomen, knocking the wind from the creature and throwing it from his wife. He pounced upon the changeling and began to swing his hooves into it. With every strike, there was an audible crack as the hard exoskeleton of the fiend began to break apart. The stallion screamed at the changeling beneath him, and his brutal assault continued. Blood and snot flew up from the beast's face, covering the guard in stinking, viscous bodily fluids. After moments, the changeling lay dead, and the guard relented. His chest heaved up and down as he sucked down oxygen. He turned his head to look at his wife. He could hear her wheezing through a tear in her throat. He moved to her. A portion of her face had been caved in, and a massive portion of her throat had been torn and hung raggedly from her neck. Blood spurted from where a carotid artery was torn, and with every beat of her fading heart it would erupt violently. Croaks emitted from her massacred throat as she tried to tell him something. He felt hot tears leak down his cheeks and fall into her body as she stopped moving, and the life in her eyes faded away. "No," he said as he pulled her into his chest and began to rock back and forth. "No, no, no." From the corner, the screams had died down to sniffles. He turned to see his daughter still laying there, curled up into a ball, her tiny wings outspread as if to protect her. He respectfully laid his wife down. He swept his hoof over her eyes, shutting them for eternity. He moved to his daughter, scooping up her tiny orange body. She struggled for a moment until she peered up to see her father's face, soaked in blood and discolored with various bodily fluids and covered with tiny flecks of bone and bits of exoskeleton. "It's okay," he whispered down to her. "I promise," he continued to say, to softly whisper down to her as her tiny hose clamped around his neck. He stood, holding her to his chest. He turned away from his dead wife, keeping the sight from his daughter. He walked out of the house that had been given to him through the guard. He scanned the street, looking side to side. His daughter wept quietly into his chest. Her tiny purple mane got caught up into his mouth and nostrils as he held her. The stallion looked up to see the sky was still filled with angry, black changelings zooming about like flies, keeping him on the ground. He moved away from his home, using his wings to keep him balanced as he ducked into an alley. He sat with his back to his house, breathing heavily. He looked down at his daughter. She looked up at him with her eyes were overflowing with tears and her cheeks were stained. "Papa," she said, "it's okay, baby. It's going to be okay," he reassured her as he stroked her mane. "Papa is going to take care of everything." He looked about. His muscles tensed as he heard the buzz of wings. Without waiting, he hopped to his hooves and unfurled his wings. He pushed off of the ground into the sky, trying to distance himself from the doom that was coming for him and his daughter. He flapped his wings harder and harder, propelling himself through the air. Behind him, he could hear the changelings as they slobbered and screeched behind him. His daughter squirmed in his grip, trying to push herself closer to her father, where it was safe from the danger. No matter how hard he flapped, the changelings caught him. Sorry, there should be a comma there. No matter how hard he flapped, the changelings caught him. In a flash, he felt an impact across his back as a changeling rammed him. He fell from the air, folding his wings up around his body. He turned over in the air, trying to get his body between the unforgiving ground and his beloved daughter. As he fell, he looked up into the sky. It had the promise of being a nice day, with a few clouds in the sky and the sun shining brightly, and then his vision was blocked by a snarling changeling as it screamed its bloodlust at him. He felt a rib snap as he smashed into the dirt. His body slid for a few feet until the slide was arrested as his head ran into a house. Stars danced before his vision. "Papa! Papa!" his daughter screamed as slobbering black fiends fell from the sky, drool falling from between their jaws as their multifaceted eyes locked onto the pair. "Run!" he commanded his foal. "Head for the palace!" She looked behind herself at the changelings. "Go!" he yelled, putting a hoof beneath her and launching her into the air. As she flew up into the houses, she spread her tiny wings and flapped for all she was worth. His heart rose a moment as he watched the few seconds she maintained flight. He was pulled from his thoughts as a pair of fangs latched onto his rear leg. He snarled as he whipped his head around. The beast was locked onto his leg, and its two friends were about to set in as well. He reached up and pulled the helmet from his head and launched the steel into the face of the changeling about his leg. The beast squealed and relinquished its hold. The stallion moved as his training kicked in. He swung about against the first, knocking the beast back into one of its comrades, knocking the two to the ground in a tangle of holy limbs. He came to his feet in time to meet the third, and as it charged into him head first, the changeling bowled him over and bore him to the ground. The guard roared out and swung his hoof into the thing's face. The blow knocked the changeling from his body, and he rolled on top of it and began to lay into its face, beating the creature to a pulp. He was struck with the full force of two changelings from behind and lifted into the air. His minor flight ended with him smashing his face into the dirt, forcing foil and gravel into his snout. He tried to push himself up to his feet, but was smashed back into the dirt mercilessly. He felt hot, fetid breath on the nape of his neck, and drool dribbled onto his head. He flared his wings and dripped his body over, using his weight to press the changeling down. He flapped his wings again, forcing himself off his back to come up to his feet. He charged into one changeling still on its feet. He batted down with his wings, beating the creature down. He relented his attack only to bring his foreleg down onto the thing's skull, cracking the bone apart viciously. He turned about to see two remaining changelings. He reared up and flared his wings, one last brave display before he charged. The changelings leapt for him, each hissing loudly. He ran forward to meet, his wings flapping, forcing the air before him to move. The changelings were slowed by the wind, but were not stopped, and each bowled into him. He screamed as he was gored in the shoulder by a horn. He twisted his body, allowing the momentum of his attacker to continue through, throwing the changeling from his body and pulling the horn from his shoulder. The second attack smashed into him low, causing him to double over. The breath was knocked from his body, and he found it impossible to breathe as the changeling followed him to the ground. The beast snapped at his throat as he threw up a hoof to block the beast. The thing's long pink tongue snaked from its mouth to lick at his face, lacerating his face with venomous saliva. He used his wings again to force himself over, rolling the changeling with him. He sucked in hard, forcing oxygen into his brutalized lungs. He forced his hoof into the changeling's throat, cutting off the oxygen for the beast. Its tongue came out again and tried to lick at its face, all while it hissed and spat as it struggled underneath him. The beast's hot breath came out smelling of rotten, sickly, sweet corruption as it invaded his nostrils. He took his free hoof and smashed the changeling's face weakly as the tendons inside his shoulder burned from the goring. He raised his gaze to see the changeling's partner trying to stand after its charge, and sent it headlong into a fruit and watched which the changeling had smashed through. Oh boy. The guard held his hoof to the changeling's throat, hearing it wheeze and rasp as it tried to free itself. He pushed his second hoof into the throat, adding whatever power he could to end the thing's horrible existence. The changeling's struggles grew weaker and weaker as it lost air until it finally stopped. He looked up to see the last of the tree shaking its head to clear its vision. The stallion was not going to let it jump on him. He ran, pushing his tortured muscles to the already stretched limits. He could feel exhaustion setting in as he spread his wings one last time to overtake the dazed changeling. Look. He smashed bodily into the fiend, sending it over into the ground. He held the thing into the dirt and used his good hoof to smash it into the ground angrily. He smashed its face repeatedly with his good hoof, hoping against hope that his daughter, his precious foal, made it to safety. The changeling stopped moving, green and black blood dripping from the thing's skull. The guard sucked in oxygen, setting up on the corpse of his defeated foe. He tried to stand, but his legs refused to work right as the bite wound shot pain through to his hip, and his blood spat from the holes. His shoulder oozed, and the several cuts along his face burned as he spit from the changeling's mouth began to infect his wounds. Stumbling his way into the wall of the house and slid down the side to come to a rest with his back to it. He looked at the street, at aftermath, what felt like the most brutal and intense fight of his life, as his vision began to waver some. He wiped his face with his hoof, but immediately regretted it, as its acidic spit was only rubbed in deeper. He looked up to the sky to see that it had cleared considerably, but there were still changelings flying about. A thought came to his mind as his vision began to gray some as his shoulder began to bleed more profusely. The thought came in the form of a verse, an old verse, to the song that he had learned back in his initiate days. He'd sung the song many times over a mug of cider and over the gravestone of a fallen comrade. Sing with me, brothers, our bloody funeral song. Sing with me through the day and the whole night long. He pushed himself up a bit as he found the beat in his mind. A small smile crept across his broken and bloodied face. We sing this day for the dead, and all are dying, but we mourn over the rim of a mug, no sobbing or crying. We hope that you can hear us, as we will sing for you. You died with your honor. You did what we all must do. So hear us loud and hear us clear. The day is not yet through, but I'll find you in heaven or hell, brother. I'll find you. He watched the horizon as 3 more changelings immediately veered in their course, making their way for him. They landed before him and raged beyond belief, as if angered by his hubris at bleeding out. The stallion tried to stand, but his limbs refused to answer his mind. The changeling descended upon him, screeching their fury to the sky and keeping the stallion from finishing the song. The streets were finally cleared and the dead rounded up. The numbers were frightening from both sides, but thanks to Captain Shining Armor and Princess Cadence, the death toll went no higher. The funeral was held 2 days before the new wedding date was set. The graves stretched far across the fields behind the palace, reaching nearly to the horizon. Hundreds of families stood over the fresh-dug graves of their husbands, fathers, wives, and mothers. Scootaloo looked down to the graves of both of her parents, silent tears falling down her face. Sweetie Belle and Apple Bloom stood on either side, doing their best to comfort their friend. Behind the trio stood Rainbow Dash, Rarity, and Applejack. Fluttershy had locked herself in her room to weep and keep away from the dead. Twilight stood next to the princesses, and Pinkie wandered about, giving condolences and trying her best to raise the spirits of every pony as best she could. Papa, Mama, Scootaloo whispered. Rainbow Dash came down to her knees and wrapped the tiny Pegasus in her wings as Scootaloo. It'll be okay, kid, Rainbow promised as Scootaloo wept quietly into her chest. He carried me, Scootaloo sobbed. He kept them from getting me. She began to sob loudly. She fought one off of me, and it killed her. She inhaled deeply and continued to sob. Mama, Papa, Scootaloo cried out into Rainbow Dash's chest. Tears and snot leaked from her face like an open faucet. Rainbow held the tiny Pegasus tight, tears beginning to stream down her face as well. The friends came close to Scootaloo, each one of their eyes watering as they watched Scootaloo mourn. I'll take care of you, kid, I promise, Rainbow said. Sweetie Belle couldn't help it and burst into tears as well, adding her high-pitched voice to the growing cacophony of wailing that was coming up from the field as widows and orphans stood over the graves of their lost family. There was a sound of shifting armor behind. Apple Bloom turned to see a guard coming up behind them. His coat was half black, half white, along the length of his body. He held his helmet under one foreleg, with a set of shiny bars on the front of his armor. Apple Bloom nudged her sister. Applejack wiped the tears from her eyes and turned to look at the guard. Applejack gently moved away from the group to speak with the guard. Now isn't a good time, Applejack said softly. I know, but I'm here to speak with the filly, the guard replied just as quietly. Applejack looked over her shoulder, and Rainbow came up behind her, still holding Scootaloo to her chest. She doesn't want to talk to you right now, Rainbow said, her voice heavy with sorrow. Please, the guard said, stepping forward. It's about her father. Scootaloo turned her head about to look at the guard. Her eyes were puffy, and her cheeks were red and streaked. What about Papa? She asked, smiling. Or sniffing. The guard knelt down. May we speak somewhat privately? He asked, as he set his helmet on the grass. Scootaloo nodded, and looked up to Rainbow. The blue pony set the filly down. Scootaloo made her way shakily over to the guard, and sat in the grass in front of him. She had calmed some, but the guard knew that this was part of the cycle of mourning, that she would burst forth again in a few minutes. The guard reached into his dress saddlebag and pulled out a tiny blue box. Here in this, the guard began. He opened the box to reveal a medal in the shape of Celestia's cutie mark. He took several of the enemy with him, inadvertently causing a distraction to allow several civilians as well as yourself to make it to safety. The guard handed the box to Scootaloo. He died a hero, he said, as he rested a hoof on her shoulder, trying to comfort the filly some. It didn't help. Thank you, Scootaloo lied. She didn't want this medal. The guard nodded and stood to leave, gathering up his helmet. Rainbow bent down and picked Scootaloo back up and flew them to their seats in preparation of the service. Rainbow sat down and held Scootaloo as the filly wept quietly. There was the sound of some pony tapping a microphone in a test, and then Celestia began to speak. These brave ponies behind me, she began, were victims of a horrible attack, as you all know. Most are the members of my personal guard, and I feel a deep loss within my heart. The princess wiped the corner of her eye and paused as she tried to gather herself. Those ponies chose to put themselves in this position, and each will be remembered in the halls of my palace as their names will be added to the lists of the honored fallen. But the worst tragedy, the most heart-wrenching truth, are the bodies of the non-combatants, the bodies of the foals and the mares who were at home when the changelings struck and murdered in cold blood. The loss of innocent life is abhorrent and appalling. The princess had to pause again as a tear fell from her eye. I promise to you, my remaining subjects, that the enemy has been repaid in full for their horrible crimes. I mourn with you, my subjects, and I will pray the fallen on their way of a comfortable afterlife. The princess choked up and had to step away from the microphone, her eulogy over. The civilians filed away, most still sobbing loudly. It took nearly an hour for all of them to finally leave, but the guards were a patient lot. After the civilians had all left, the guards moved forward to stand before the massive graves. At the fore of the formed-up group stood a lieutenant with a white and black coat. He cleared his throat and sounded out a note. The living guards' ponies around him sounded the same note as they began to sing. Sing with me, my brothers, our bloody funeral song. Sing with me through the day and the whole night long. Sing this day for the dead and all of our dying. But we mourn over the rim of a mug, no sobbing or crying. We hope that you can hear us as we sing for you. You died with your honor. You did what we all must do. So hear us loud and hear us clear. The day is not yet through. But we'll find you in heaven or hell, brother. We'll find you. And once we join you in the halls of the dead, we'll laugh and remember all that was done and said. But those of us who outlive you, my dear brothers, dear friend, will honor you and your end. There was a collective breath, and the stallions began to speak as one. Sleep, O brothers. We relieve you of your post and your duty. We promise to uphold your example and lead future generations by it. As one of the guards saluted their fallen comrades, showing their respect for their dead. Author's note. This year was a difficult one so far for me and my family. My uncle and stepdad have come back from Afghanistan this year, and it was emotional and wonderful. But my father's being deployed later this year, and it's hard. Welcoming back two soldiers when my dad still has to go out, especially on my mother and me. I deal with adversity and depression through this verse, and this time I came up with the funeral song. I hope you enjoyed it. Whew, where to begin? So, I'm going to say, on the whole, this was good. This was.
Mm-hmm.
What did you think? This is the second time you've heard the story. Tell me what you thought of it.
Going back through it, there was a good portion of description lacking in terms of the whole show don't tell kind of thing. I mean, there was a lot of us. There was a lot of times where we were being told what was happening, but we really didn't get to see it. You know.
Yes.
There were definitely some grammar issues, some commas that were missing in a lot of the sentences. There was a bit of, as you in pencil say, the baby moments. You know, like they were just repetitive words being used.
Yeah, there was some repetition at times. Face was a really bad. Face, blood. There was snot, I suppose. But then again, there's only so much you could do. The action sequences got a little repetitive.
Yeah.
But action is really, really hard to write. And I have to admit, for all in all, it didn't feel like you were trying to write Dragon Ball Z fiction. I mean, that's good. That is very good.
Mm-hmm.
What else did you think?
The lyrics still kind of hit me pretty good. You know, after probably a year and a half of the last time I read this, they still get me pretty good when I hear them. So
I was gonna say my lyrics are probably one of my favorite parts of this story, and I'm finding it very difficult to do much criticism on this because as I began to read through this, as we do these writers' workshop stories, this is always going into it completely blind. So you get some of those natural stutters in my voice and the natural struggle as I read through it blindly. But I could tell that this was being written from a very emotional part of this writer. This is something that's close to them. And it's not just something that they wrote because they thought it would gain a lot of traction. This was something for them. And I want to emphasize the importance of things like this. Stories that you know that they aren't going to get a super lot of traction, get a ton of views, but they're important to you and they help you work through difficult moments in your life. There's an edge to this story, and I don't. It's because of that I don't want to do things like bring forth the curiosity that Scootaloo's parents live in Canterlot, but she lives in Ponyville.
which is why I think the alternate universe tag is used here. You know,
Yeah,
gives it just a little bit of liberty.
yeah, no, and that's really important because without that, canon people probably would have gone crazy with this over little plot holes and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Which this story I don't think deserves. The intent of the story was very clear. Help the author work through a struggle that they're having, and I hope. I think that's probably best where I want to leave my thoughts. I really hope Laarsgaard's family is okay. It's really what it amounts to. I can tell that it weighed a lot on them and that they're going through a hard time. I hope that things are good for them. On the whole, the story was good, and I'm happy that this story was able to help them work through the struggle that they're having.
that all well and good. As far as critiquing a story goes, I don't want to tear into this. Like, this story doesn't deserve it.
It's definitely what's that word you guys use? Cathartic?
Catharsis.
Catharsis. It's catharsis writing for this person, basically, is what it is.
Mm-hmm. And catharsis writing is very important to every writer. If there's something that you just need to say, or you have to put out there, just do it. Just know that not everyone's going to be happy with it, but as long as you're happy with it, that's what matters in the end. And if you're trying to improve, then you can listen to critiques.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm not going to tear this one apart. This was good. Good job. So, do you have any closing thoughts?
I can't say it's entirely aged well from memory to reading it now, but it's still something I would recommend to read.
Yeah, I think if someone wants to... It's not the best example of action-based writing I've ever seen, but that said, if someone wants to see what I think, what the mentality of the Guard is for when they lose a soldier, I think this does have a good example of that. So, alrighty. Well, on that note, thank you for watching this episode of the Writer's Workshop. This has been Flutter Priest and Milk.
Bye.
See ya. Damn. Whew, you weren't joking. That one was a story.
Yeah. 4,000 words, and it's got its little moments that fucking hit you, and then the other times it's like there's too much repetition.
Yeah, the action scenes were almost a bit of a drawl at times. I think there was literally a part in there where I began scrolling down and I saw there was just more action, and I went, oh boy.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt bad about that because it became very clear very quickly that this was a passion project. This wasn't necessarily an item that was meant to be torn apart. So I was trying to figure out already halfway through the story, how in the world was I going to critique this? And I think this is good. I don't think this is one that we wanted to tear apart. This one, I'm just happy is getting some sort of audio reading, because I think it'll probably mean a lot to Laarsgaard.
Well, I mean, Laarsgaard's been gone for 2 years now, if you look at his account. 115 weeks, was it, last that he was on?
Oh, shit, really?
116.
Yep, he did.
The last blog post he made was back in 2014, so, I mean, and that's also right around the time I read it, so it's a good chance that after I had read it and commented, it's gone as of, he left right after that, so...